In the spring of 1327, officers of the City of London pulled up the floorboards in a row of bakehouses near Bread Street. Underneath, they found a hole. Someone had cut a small trapdoor into the bottom of the moulding board, the table where a baker shaped his dough. Customers brought their own dough to be baked because most homes had no oven. And while that dough sat on the table, a child crouched in the dark below, reaching up through the hole, pinching away handful after handful. The bakers were caught. They were tied to wooden hurdles, dragged through the streets with the stolen dough strung around their necks, and their names were written into the city's permanent record. That was the punishment for cheating people out of bread in medieval England. Public, fast, and certain. Now pick up the loaf on your counter. You almost certainly do not know what is in it. Food fraud costs the global food industry an estimated $30 to $40 billion a year, and grain products are among the most tampered with foods on earth. And if something is wrong with your bread, no one is dragged anywhere. At worst, they pay a fine and keep selling. The medieval baker was watched, weighed, and punished harder than almost any worker in his town. Not because medieval people hated bakers, but because bread was survival, and the system existed to protect the person buying it. Today we walk through that system. The 7-year apprenticeship that started with hauling water. The law that fixed the weight of every loaf in England. The night shift that broke his body. And the machine of informers built to catch him. Let's start with the first one. The medieval baker did not drift into the trade. He was assembled for it, slowly, over years, inside one of the oldest guilds in Europe. The bakers of London were already organised as a sworn fraternity by 1155, when they appear in royal records paying dues to the crown. That makes their guild older than the English Parliament itself. To get in, a boy was bound as an apprentice, usually at 12 or 14, for a term of 7 years. 7 years with no wage for the right to one day sell bread. He got a corner to sleep in and food from the master's table. In exchange, the master owned his labour completely. The first year was not baking at all, it was carrying. He hauled water, split firewood, and dragged sacks of grain that weighed nearly as much as he did. He sifted flour through cloth to pull out grit and stones, then swept that same flour dust off every surface in the bakehouse. It got into everything, including his lungs. We will come back to that. By the 2nd and 3rd year, he was allowed near the dough. He learned to judge fermentation with his hands, by slackness and smell, because there were no clocks fine enough and no thermometers at all. He learned to read the oven. A wood-fired brick oven gives you one attempt. You burn a fire inside it for hours, rake out every coal, and bake on the stored heat as it slowly falls. Misjudge that heat and you have ruined a day of grain, some of it belonging to paying customers. Apprentices learn to gauge the temperature by holding a bare arm inside the oven mouth and counting. After 7 years he could be made a journeyman. Only after years more of proven work and the approval of the guild could he become a master with a bakehouse of his own. That was the gentlest part of the system. Because the moment a baker finally owned his oven, he discovered he did not control the most important thing about his own business. He could not set his price. A law written 60 years before he was born had already done it for him. The second part of the system was the law, and in England the law that governed bread was older and more relentless than almost anything else on the books. It was called the Assize of Bread. It was set down in lasting form around 1266 under Henry III, which makes it one of the earliest consumer protection laws in English history. It was still being enforced more than 500 years later. What it did was tie the legal weight of a loaf directly to the current price of wheat. The price of the loaf stayed fixed, often at a farthing or a penny, because ordinary people counted their money in those coins and could not absorb a change. So when grain got expensive, the the baker was not allowed to charge more. He was ordered to bake a smaller loaf, down to an exact weight published by the authorities. When grain was cheap, the loaf grew. The coin never moved. The bread did. And the law did not stop at weight. The assize laid out what a baker was permitted to earn. It calculated his allowance for fuel, for salt, for yeast, for the candles he burned working at night, for the wages of his journeymen, even for his household. The medieval state had effectively audited the baker's entire business and printed the result. His profit was a number set by a clerk. Think about what that did to a man trying to feed his own family. He could not raise his price. His costs, the grain especially, swung wildly with every bad harvest. The only variable he could quietly touch was the weight of the loaf. Shave a little off each one, and across 1,000 loaves a week, that is real money. The law knew this. That is why the law weighed. This is also where one of the most familiar phrases in English comes from, the baker's dozen. Bakers were so frightened of being caught a single loaf short that many simply added a 13th loaf to every batch of 12. Not generosity, insurance against the pillory. The assize treated the baker as a man who would cheat the moment no one was measuring. That sounds harsh until you ask whether they were right. Because the work itself, the actual nightly labour of baking, gave him every reason in the world to cut corners. The third part of the system was the work, and the work happened in the dark. Bread had to be ready at dawn. A town woke up wanting bread, and bread takes hours. So the baker's day began when everyone else's ended. He lit his oven late in the evening and worked straight through the night, kneading and proving and shaping, so the first loaves were cooling as the market opened. He slept in fragments, in the heat near the oven. That heat is hard to overstate. A working oven in a small bakehouse turned the room into something close to a furnace. Bakers worked stripped down and soaked in sweat through the coldest nights of winter. Burns were ordinary. So was the slow damage you could not see in a day. Kneading dough by hand, for hours, every night, for decades, wears out shoulders, wrists, and the lower back. And then there is the flour. A bakehouse is full of airborne flour dust, and breathing it night after night scars the lungs. That is not a medieval guess. Flour dust is one of the most common causes of occupational asthma in the world today, and modern health agencies still rank bakery work among the higher risk jobs for chronic lung disease. The medieval baker had the same lungs we do, far worse ventilation, and no idea what was happening to him. But the deadliest thing in a medieval bakehouse was not the heat, or the dust, or the hours. It was something no baker could see, taste, or smell, and modern science only fully explained it in the last 100 years. It is a fungus called ergot. Ergot grows on rye, especially after a wet season, replacing healthy grain with a hard, dark, poisonous kernel that looks almost normal. Milled into flour and baked into bread, it carries a load of powerful toxins. Eating that bread caused a disease medieval Europe called St. Anthony's fire. It cut off blood to the hands and feet until they blackened and, in the worst cases, fell away. It caused violent convulsions and terrifying hallucinations. Whole districts were struck at once. One outbreak in southern France in the year 944 is recorded as killing thousands. Nobody at the time knew the cause. They blamed sin, curses, bad air. The chemistry behind it was only isolated and understood in the 20th century, and the same family of compounds, refined in a Swiss laboratory in 1938, produced the drug LSD. This is what the baker stood in the middle of. He took in grain that other people had grown and milled, and he turned it into the bread the whole town ate. If that bread was poisoned, his name was stamped on it. but he could not see the poison. The surveillance system we are about to describe was built to catch the cheating a baker chose to do. The thing most likely to actually kill his customers was invisible to him and to everyone else. So the medieval town did the only thing it could. If you cannot see inside the bread, you watch the man who makes it. Constantly. That was the fourth part of the system, and the medieval English town was very good at it. Start with the loaf itself. Bakers were required to stamp every loaf with their own distinct mark, a personal seal pressed into the dough before baking. A marked loaf can be traced. Pull a suspicious loaf off any market stall, weigh it, and the stamp says exactly whose oven it came from. Every loaf a baker sold was a signed confession waiting to be read. Then there were the searchers. The bakers' own guild appointed wardens to inspect bakehouses, and the city appointed officials to weigh bread in the markets without warning. A baker could be at his stall on an ordinary morning when an officer lifted his loaves onto a scale and checked them against the weight the assize demanded that week. Customers were encouraged to complain, neighbours informed on neighbours. And when the authorities really wanted a baker, they did not just weigh his bread, they investigated him. Which brings us back to where this started. In 1327, London received complaints that bakers were stealing dough from the very customers who hired them. The city did not simply issue fines. It sent officers into the bakehouses and tore up the floors, and underneath it found the trapdoors cut into the moulding tables. The method was patient and quiet. A customer brought her own dough, set it on the table, and trusted the baker. While the dough was worked, an accomplice underneath, often a small child because the space was tight, drew off pieces through the hole. The customer carried home a slightly smaller loaf than her dough should have made. The baker collected a steady supply of free dough, stolen one handful at a time from people who never saw it happen. The case became notorious because it confirmed the suspicion the whole system was built on. The baker, left unwatched, would steal the bread out of your hands while smiling at you. The men caught in that scandal were not quietly fined and forgotten. They were turned into a public lesson, because the fifth part of the system, the part the whole town could see, was the punishment. A baker caught selling underweight or adulterated bread was not sent to a quiet cell. He was locked in the pillory, the wooden frame that held his head and hands, and set up in the busiest part of the market. Often the faulty loaf itself was hung around his neck, so everyone walking past knew the exact crime. Some offenders were dragged there on a hurdle through the filth of the streets in front of every customer and competitor they had. The point was not pain, the point was the audience. A baker's trade depended entirely on trust. People handed him their grain, their dough, and their money on the assumption that he would not rob them. An hour in the pillory with a bad loaf around your neck destroyed that trust permanently. And for repeat offenders, the guild could do something worse than humiliation. It could ban a man from the trade for good, ending the only career his 7 years had ever trained him for. So look at the whole machine now. A boy gives 7 unpaid years to get in. A national law fixes his price and dictates his profit down to the candle. He works through the night in heat and dust that quietly ruin his body. He stamps his name into every loaf so the state can trace it back to him. Searchers weigh his bread without warning, neighbours inform on him, and officers will tear up his floor on suspicion alone. And if he is caught, he is broken in public. It is tempting to see that as pure cruelty toward one worker. It was something colder than that. It was the price of a guarantee. Every harsh piece of that machine existed, so the person buying a loaf, usually poor, often someone who would go hungry over the missing weight, could trust bread they had no way to test themselves. What happened then when that machine was finally taken apart? The assize of bread lasted an extraordinarily long time, but by the early 1800s, With new economic thinking arguing that markets should set their own prices, it was swept away. The assize was abolished for London in 1815 and across the rest of England soon after. After roughly 5.5 centuries, the law that weighed every loaf in the country was gone. The baker was free, and the bread got worse. Once no official was checking, adulteration in British bread became open and routine. In 1820, a chemist named Frederick Ackham published an investigation into food adulteration that named names and described the practices in plain detail. Bread was being whitened and bulked out with alum, with chalk, with ground bone, and with substances considerably more dangerous than those. The 19th century loaf, sold in a free market with nothing like the assize watching it, was often a worse and more poisonous product than the bread the medieval pillory had protected. It took decades of scandal and entirely new food safety laws to claw that protection back. The modern version is real, but it is gentler. It runs on labels, inspections, and trust. When it fails, and food fraud is a $30 to $40 billion problem worldwide, the punishment is a fine, absorbed as a cost of doing business. No one is stamped with their name. No one is dragged through anything. The medieval baker was watched because bread was life, and a town that could not see inside a loaf decided it would see everything else instead. The brutality had a logic. It was the visible shape of something quieter, a society admitting it did not trust the people who fed it, and building a cage strong enough to make that distrust safe. The baker spent his whole working life inside that cage. The people who bought his bread are the reason it was built. Subscribe to Medieval Way, where every week we dig up the buried machinery behind ordinary things. And tell us in the comments which part of the baker's life was the worst. The 7 unpaid years. The law that fixed his price down to the candle. The dust that wrecked his lungs. Or the trapdoor cut into the table to rob the customer he was smiling at. We read every comment. Until next time, weigh what you trust.